Uh, Good evening, everyone. It would be really helpful if everyone puts themselves on mute, just so we'll be able to hear both Ellen and Emily. There is the chat box, so feel free if you have questions to use the chat box. Don't be surprised if Ellen kind of calls on you, and then you can take yourself off mute if she wants to do voice to voice. A couple kind of housekeeping things. Sharu mentioned this mentoring program. We piloted a mentoring program about a year ago with 4 women that we paired 4 women who wanted to be on boards with 4 women that were already sitting corporate directors. It was highly successful, and the corporate board committee is now looking to do another mentoring program. So if any of you are interested in that, please let me know, and I'll make sure I pass that on to Sharu and the rest of the team to make sure your name gets in the hat. And again, I don't know how many women will get chosen. We only had 4 for the pilot, but my understanding is I think we have some potential space. You'll have to give us your bio and things like that. But if you're interested, it was a really good program. The women that participated loved it. I want to talk to you before we get started, just a couple
Can
of
I just say quickly there, but to do it soon because we're trying to finalize the names over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, so before the end of the month. How's
I was a mentor, and I loved doing it.
yeah,
So just from the other side.
a couple of events that you want to put on your calendar. November 4th, if you have not signed up for the corporate salute, you do not want to miss this. So I think we already have 800 people signed up for the salute and counting. But if you're not one of those 800, please sign up for it's November 4th. November 15th will be our last board education event for the corporate board committee for the year. And that will be board and finance 2.0. And then we'll start up in January. We're doing a co-host with NACD New England. They've graciously allowed the Boston Club members to join at the NACD New England rate for this ESG event. So be looking for that on our dashboard. And then we have events on February and a couple events in March. NACD New England Aspiring Boot Camp will be, is it March 24th or 25th, Ellen?
24th, and we're planning in person. And for those of you who haven't heard about it, it's 1 full day. We have literally 8 to 10 more than, yeah, speakers on a variety of topics. If you haven't sat on a public company board, we're going to have experienced directors there. We're going to have hit all the big topics that you really need to be thinking about before you walk into your first public company board interview. Because these are things, the assumption is that you are educated enough so that you understand these things before you walk in. So, and it's a 1 day, and we do it NACD. Now I've got my NACD hat on since I chair all of programming and sit on that board. And Hillary and I have been working this sort of jointly from Boston Club and NACD sides for a couple of years. And the best part, honestly, is the networking, because you will have men and women in that room. You will have other people who are networking, but you will also have people who are already sitting on boards who will be there to network with.
And I want to build on that. So, and we thank you, NACD New England and Ellen, for putting this on. Again, there is a fee for this, but we also get the NACD New England fee. The other thing is, some of you may look at the program and say, we've done some of these topics. What Ellen has worked to do and behind the scenes is there'll be different speakers. So while the topics may be the same, you might get a different piece. So with that, I want to transition into the program today. Today, we're talking about boards and their legal obligations. And what I'm really excited, I'll turn it over to you in a second, Ellen, is that we're building on to some of the other conversations we've had about legal. And I think you're going to love what Emily has to talk about. She just has a different twist to a topic that you might go, oh, well, what more can I learn about legal? But I think you'll find from today's program, you're going to learn a whole lot. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ellen. Take it away.
Thanks. Okay, so for those of you who've been here before, you know the format. We have today a very special guest, a very special speaker, Emily Taylor, a partner at Latham & Watkins, a preeminent global law firm. One of her partners, Phil Rossetti, and I have worked, I hate to tell you, over 35 years together on different, in different situations. A great law firm. If you aren't familiar with them, they're fabulous. Emily, again, she's been tasked with, this is not your basic present law presentation. This is the 201 or the 301, get us current, because there's a lot of stuff going on that directors are constantly trying to keep themselves updated with. And please do write questions in chat, and we'll do our best to either at the end or during bring them in. And so with that, honestly, Emily, it's all yours. I know you're going to be outstanding. I'm going to go on mute until we start to get to the questions back and forth, just in case my dog decides he wants to bark at a squirrel or something.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And does everyone see that? Okay, so Ellen or anyone, I do really encourage you to speak up or ask any questions or provide your own experience, because the goal of tonight really in talking with Ellen and Hillary is not just to talk about the role of boards, but really like what are the current trends? What are people talking about in board meetings now? I sit in a lot of board meetings, private and public companies, so I hear a lot of the chatter, but every board is different. And I do also find that people report back things being talked at other boards or different ways of looking at things that can be really helpful. So that's a benefit of a group like this, is sharing what everyone is hearing really helps educate everyone and make everybody smarter and better prepared for their next meeting. So just a quick reminder, because I know we all kind of come to this with different levels of experience. So I'll keep this short, but really a reminder of the role of the board and the individual directors is really about supervision, right? You're not making the day-to-day decisions, but you are supervising the people that the board has determined should be in charge of the company, the officers, the employees. So in some ways, it tends to be very reactive, right? You're reacting to situations that occur, you're reacting to questions, you're reacting to requests to approve things, and there's really an element of it that has to be proactive. And I think the traps that some people fall into is the sort of luxury of sitting back, waiting for those meetings, waiting to be sent materials and reacting to them. But being proactive is really important so that when you're asked to weigh in, when you're asked to react to something, you really have the background and the knowledge necessary to ask those hard questions. And it's always a balance at board meetings, right? You get people who really dominate the conversation and ask a million questions, some of which seem to be going down a rabbit hole. Then you have other people who are really just intaking information and don't weigh in a lot. It's a balance to make sure you're asking hard questions and you're culling out the information you need to know to make high level, important, game-changing decisions without feeling like you're overwhelming management and micromanaging them. So I think doing your work to be being proactive and doing your work to understand the business will help you find that balance of where do you need to prod and where can you absorb the information and have faith in what you're hearing. Also, I don't think you can have a presentation on boards without saying, reminding folks about the fiduciary duties of directors. Certainly, whenever boards are making really tricky decisions, we always remind them about their fiduciary duties. So under by law, most of the companies I work with are under Delaware law, but it's true of all states. There are fiduciary duties of directors to the company. The primary one that we'll probably touch on the most tonight, or you can have in the back of your mind as you think about these things tonight, is the duty of care. Because again, being proactive and understanding the trends in the industry, understanding the trends with companies in general, understanding SEC trends, really helps you then make informed decisions when you're asked to. So, careful, informed decision-making helps you satisfy your duty of care. So on to the more exciting aspect. Probably the biggest change in the SEC in a long time has been the advent of Gary Gensler. So he was nominated by Biden in February and appointed in April. So since mid-April, folks have been speculating, what does it mean to be, a Gensler-led SEC? We have some hints, right? There's been a lot of speculation, and now we have a little bit more data from things that he's said in speeches, things that he's written, small actions that the SEC has taken since he's joined. But the three big ones that people tend to be focused on are board diversity, cybersecurity, and climate change. All three of those have been, either mentioned in a speech or he's testified in front of Congress. Some indication that these are areas of interest from him and that we can expect to see more movement from the SEC. I think one important thing to remember is having Gensler at the head of the SEC is a change because it is a Democrat. He has spoken on issues and topics that have not been priorities for the SEC. Some have, like cybersecurity, but he is now taking a position on new topics. But he's just the head of the SEC, right? He can't alone make any decisions. So it really means that from the top, there's going to be initiatives that he puts in place, but the SEC, which is still, has multiple dual political bodies sitting on the committee, still has to make decisions together. So other than perhaps climate change, which we expect to happen in 2021, some of these things are longer term priorities.
So Emily, before you leave this, if I could, you had a question from the last slide, which was in chat, which was, to whom is the duty of care owed?
It is owed to the corporation, which is defined as the stockholders. So every action that the board takes should be in the best interest of the corporation, meaning the corporation stockholders. There's actually a lot of debate in Delaware and in other states now about making decisions in the best interest of stakeholders instead of stockholders, meaning, right, the employees and the community where the office is, where the factory is. So it's definitely a developing topic, but as of now, the formal fiduciary duty is still acting in the best interest of all stockholders.
So there's another thing that somebody asked in chat, if we can go on full screen, but what you can do to make the slides larger is literally move the arrow sort of in the middle of the page and just enlarge in the left side, which shows the slides, and then Emily just gets smaller. So if you need it, I know that from my perspective, it looks good. So hopefully that helps.
You're welcome to make it as small as possible.
But the second question is really on the next slide, your slide with the new SEC chair. Mm-hmm. So you talked about the fact that he can't make these changes alone, but in fact, he does have a lot of influence. And I guess, you said we'll know more over time, but can you give us, I can tell you that I just came back from a 3-day board meeting, and a lot of the conversation, at least in the audit committee, and then at different points in the board meeting, was about what do we really expect him to do? And really the focus was, and when, especially around ESG, which we're expecting some requirements from a fiduciary reporting perspective. Could you give us a little more on that?
Yeah, so The good news is that none of these actions take us by surprise, right? Because the SEC does not come down with a rule that goes into automatic effect. So there's a process to these things that gives folks a long lead time. It's typically putting out a proposed rule, opening it up for a comment period, of which, depending on the number of comments, how much people care. All of these are available, publicly available, so you can see how people are weighing in on the topic. And then, a revised rule or a refined rule and a final rule. So these things take time to put in place, and we'll know, so you'll know well in advance of actually implementing something. And then there's also, once a new rule is put in place, there's typically a delay in the implementation. And when we can talk a little bit more about board diversity and even how that rule, which is a Nasdaq rule, but SEC approved, has sort of delayed implementation over time, because everybody recognizes that even just disclosure requirements take time to fold into an internal corporate governance process. So none of this stuff is quick, and none of this stuff takes us by surprise. What can be most surprising is, for example, we know that Gensler wants to come out with mandatory climate change disclosure, ESG/climate change disclosure in 2021. I'd say it's a 0.1% chance that anybody is reporting mandatory disclosure this year, probably not even in the next 10Ks, right? Because by the time they get through that process, come up with the final rule and roll out the implementation, there'll be probably several quarterly cycles before that. But we do know that these things are priorities, so we can expect to hear more. And oftentimes when they want to come out with a proposed rule, but they don't have the internal consensus to, you start seeing more speeches or more interviews, or Gensler testified in front of the House a week or two ago on a climate change topic. So you sort of know they are gearing up to tell people this is what they're focused on, this is what they're talking about behind closed doors. So Ellen, do you want to skip ahead to climate change? I think I could sort of hit it later in the presentation, but I'm happy to jump around if you want to stay
No,
on
I'd keep going. I'll keep going because I have some different questions when you get further.
Okay. I think the other just general trend at the SEC is an increased use of data analytics and technologies as part of their governance. So there have been sort of 3 relatively high profile cases lately where one, including Hilton, where the SEC was monitoring certain disclosure, was really monitoring their EPS disclosure, and noticed an inconsistency. And that caused them to look into it further and has eventually resulted in high fines. So there have been 3 or 4 of those very recently where the start of the investigation was just a blip on a data monitoring protocol that they use, and ultimately did lead to fines and sanctions. And another area that they have said they are focusing on, although it's not entirely clear how it's being implemented, is insider trading, with sort of the thought of, folks are now working in a remote environment more. Businesses are facing more unexpected fluctuations. So there's more material things happening, positive and negative, since the pandemic has started. So it's sort of ripe for insider trading issues, because more material non-public information occurring, and people in environments that are perhaps less secure and perhaps lend themselves more to tipping or making decisions on trading that they shouldn't be making. So the SEC has historically, and FINRA has historically, used some data analytics to follow trading patterns, regionally across the country, where trading is happening, after news is announced, before news is announced. And so while the sort of details of exactly how they do it are not crystal clear, it's very clear that they are increasing the number of investigations they do, the number of times they reach out to companies asking for more data. Whenever there's a trading blip or something unexpected, they typically send a letter saying, here's the list of 200 people that have traded in your stock. Please identify each one each one that's related to an employee. And so their ability to dig into these topics is just so much greater than it used to be. And I don't know if data analytics was behind the Netflix, but in August, there was a pretty significant insider trading claim for former Netflix employees that has kind of have people, reminding their employees about, and their directors and their officers about the risks of insider trading and being more protective of company information. And Ellen, will you let me know if there's something in the chat? I'm not great at monitoring.
Yes, I will.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Okay, so then board diversity. Board diversity has been a topic gaining steam for several years now, so it's not particularly a surprise, but now it's been in the public conversation enough that it's starting to result in sort of more actionable guideposts. So the SEC standard is still disclosure based. So the SEC requires that public companies disclose how the nominating committee or the whole board, if there is no nominating committee, considers diversity when they're picking candidates, picking nominees for the board. If the answer is we don't, that's fine. There's no penalties, there's no requirements. It's really tell us how you do if you do it. And if you don't consider diversity, tell us that. And investors can make their decision. They can judge the company based on that. Institutional investors have their own guidelines, right? So they take a more strict view, and you'll see proxy firms like ISS and Glass Lewis come out with guidance. A lot of institutional investors have already and are considering new guidance, as like BlackRock and Goldman have been especially vocal about this, that they will vote against not members of the nominating committee if the board does not have enough women or racially, ethnically diverse candidates. So that type of, ISS, Glass Lewis recommendations and the institutional recommendations often don't affect the early public companies. Companies are coming out right now in the market. They actually don't typically worry too much about that. It's usually the later stage companies who now have a very broadly diverse, investor base. It's no longer their private company supporters. It's not necessarily investors that they're very close with, who are more subject to the views of institutional investors and proxy advisory firms. So when it affects the earlier, newly public companies going out the chute now, or who have been public for a few years, they view it differently. They do disclose, they do talk about it, but there's a noticeable difference as to whether they talk about it because it's a core value of the company, because it's important to the company, or whether they talk about it because of the blowback they will get from, regulators or institutional advisors. I think to date, most of the rules I've seen, state or regulatory, have been sort of the comply or explain model, which is there are target goals that whatever the state, whatever the institution is, thinks you should meet. But if you don't, justify why you didn't. The one state that took a different approach is really California. So California has two sort of sister rules that it came out with. The first, both apply to publicly listed companies, so mainly NYSE and Nasdaq, who have a principal executive office in California. So it may be a Delaware corporation, but if their principal executive office is in California, it applies to them. And the way you determine that is really to look at the 10K. So you have to list your office there. So it's a pretty black and white determination whether it applies to you or not. Now, Senate Bill 826 came first, and their requirement was that by the end of 2019, there needed to be at least one woman on the board. And by the end of this year, there needs to be 2 or 3, sort of depending on the size of the board. Smaller boards only need 2, larger boards would need 3. So when that law first came out in California, like a lot of commentary, a lot of action, a lot of people scrambling, oddly, right, to find women on boards. And the numbers of California-based companies has gone up significantly, but there is still a sort of a rub that there has not actually been a fine or a penalty for failing to meet these standards, which is not unheard of, right? That they roll these things out. I couldn't believe that 2019 actually seems like eons ago based on the pandemic. And they said there would be fines of, up to $300,000 per violation, but really they haven't come out with sort of guidelines as to how they're going to implement them. So I think the expectation is there will be penalties. There's certainly reputational penalties. So people are taking it seriously, but you're not seeing people hit with, monetary fines yet. The next law that came out in California was Assembly Bill 979. So they followed the same pattern, applies to the same group of companies, but by the end of this year, by the end of 2021, there needs to be at least one director from an underrepresented community. And that also phases in so that by the end of next year, there'd have to be 2 or 3, depending on the size of the company. So the goal of both, right, is to mandate individuals in certain categories of people on boards by a certain time frame. So that is the most aggressive version that we've seen in the United States. More recent than that, Nasdaq came out with its proposed rule at the very end of 2020, and it revised its proposed rule a few times, but the SEC just recently approved it. So it is now in effect. It's called the Nasdaq Board Diversity Rule. And interestingly, even though California, as California often is, was out of the gate being more stringent, right, a more clear policy, Nasdaq went back to the sort of comply or explain approach. So Nasdaq does have standards. Its disclosure aspect is really quite interesting. So they actually came up with a relatively set, standardized template of matrix that you're supposed to use in your 10K, or you can put it on your website, showing how your board diversity matches up, with the thought being that you can flip and look, you can compare 10 different companies, you can look at their matrix, 10 different Nasdaq companies, you can look at their matrix and you can see, right? So it's that element of disclosure is unusual. Usually it's, explain in words, language, your philosophy, how you make decisions. This is much more black and white. Fill out this table and put it in put it where the public can see it. Now the phase-in requirements are eventually we're going to get to having to have 2 diverse directors on the board, which can be, and one should be female, one should be an underrepresented or LGBTQ community member. And the timelines are actually quite long. I think I'd actually have to double check. The matrix to disclose is about 1 year. So like next August-ish. To have the one director is 2 years. And to get to 2 directors, they actually have like 4 or 5 years. So it's not imminent, except for as soon as you start, folks like Nasdaq and NYC have a lot of sway in things like this. So as soon as you put that out there, you will see a lot of early adopters who start, trying to comply with those expectations sooner.
Well, so Emily, let's just talk about this because, I guess until there's a real penalty to companies, I think there are a lot of companies out there who sort of have it in their sights. They know they need to do more. But unless they're willing to add a seat, they're not necessarily willing to retire people in order to open up a seat. So you have a timeline here. Talk to us really about the penalties, and let's start with Nasdaq, because Nasdaq's the one I actually hear the most about. Most people I've heard, the guys seem to just kind of shake their head and roll their eyes about California because they don't think any penalties will ever exist. Not really. But the Nasdaq one, I've actually heard the guys, being of the male gender and predominantly white older guys, are really actually taking that seriously, but not rushing down the road. Can you talk to us about penalties and really what you expect to come out of this?
I agree that, I think because California can be so groundbreaking and can often be an outlier in things like this, that people tend to view the California rule differently. Whereas Nasdaq, and NYC has not come out with a firm requirement yet, but those bodies are given a different sort of reverence. However, with Nasdaq, if you do not meet these targets, the penalty is that you have to disclose that, right? So there is no penalty for not adding diverse directors to your board. It's that you have to tell the world. So they're relying on institutional investor pressure, because now companies have to tell the world. And once these institutional investors know that they are choosing not to add diversity to their board, the thought being that they will then, not buy the company's stock. If they own the company's stock, not vote in favor of the nominating committee members. So it's really that reputational pressure, and Nasdaq is helping to give legs to that by forcing companies to be open about it.
So that's a very interesting point, and that ties to literally something that I heard from the boys in the last couple of days. The conversation comes back to ISS, because once you start disclosing what you have and don't have in terms of that on your board, ISS or Glass Lewis can jump into the fray and start voting for a non-vote or non-recommendation of the chair of NomGov or the chairman of the board or whatever, if there isn't sufficient diversity. Is that what you might expect could happen? Actually, as you're talking, I'm just connecting to other conversations I heard.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And again, it's funny because reputational pressure kind of comes in different ways. Sometimes it actually comes in ISS not voting for a director on your non-gov committee, which is not always fatal. They often get elected anyways, but no director likes to know that they're the target of that. So you hear discussions at board meetings where the individual on the nominating and corporate governance committee sort of saying like, hey, they're not going to vote against you. They're going to vote against me, right? I don't want to be the one who has the lowest percentage, since directors do usually compare, who gets the highest votes and who gets the lowest votes. So there is that it seeps down into the director's psyche in that way. But ISS and Glass Lewis really matters more to some companies than others. Like I said, newly public companies tend to fly under the radar. It's becoming a little bit less true. But especially in industries, tech industry, very much so, but even a little bit in life sciences, where they come out with things like a dual class voting structure. If you have a dual class voting structure where certain individuals at the company have a high vote, 10x, we're seeing 20x, there was even a 40x vote over the summer, where individuals at the company have a stock that has a higher vote than the public stockholders. They know they can control the vote. They're not subject to the whims of institutional investors. They care because of reputation, but they don't really care what ISS and Glass Lewis think, because it won't actually be actionable, right? Voting against these won't matter because they already have the vote either locked up or very strongly secure with a high class vote that's held by insiders.
Great, thanks.
And to your question about penalties, there's one of the issues is that all of these rules that come out are being litigated. So California has a whole variety of lawsuits. Generally, it's not constitutional, it's reverse discrimination type themes. And even Nasdaq, the Nasdaq diversity rule is under fire by a suit claiming that the SEC does not have the power to regulate this. So remember, because the SEC has to approve it, the SEC gets brought into the fold, and they're saying that the SEC power to regulate the markets doesn't extend to this because this has nothing to do with fraud or honest markets. So with a lot of the things that are current trends, climate change and ESG and cybersecurity, you could make a similar argument, maybe not cybersecurity. You can make a similar argument, but you'll see that theme of sort of like, well, what is the bounds of the SEC rulemaking ability? Yeah. And I think so having monetary penalties ups the ante, right? I'm guessing there's not going to be too many monetary penalties until the bounds of how far you can go with this are more well set.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think the kind of one other topic you see on boards besides diversity is really overboarding. So a lot of the institutional investors and proxy advisory firms are also becoming more attuned to how many public company boards people serve on. It's usually the guidance varies. It's usually somewhere between 2 and 4 public company boards as a maximum, and they will vote against an individual who serves on more. And that's a very clear, you can figure that out, because part of the disclosure requirements in 10Ks and S1s and things is the director bio is to list how many public company boards somebody serves on. So it's a very knowable piece of information and is taken into account when these, institutional investors look at nominees. And interestingly, sometimes that goes hand in hand with things like underrepresented communities and diversity, because if you have someone who has historically served on 8 public company boards, who now has to come off those boards so that it has a more reasonable number, then it's opening up slots for new people to join.
So that raises a different question, because and just from where I sit and what I see, I've never heard anyone say the max is less than 4. In other words, I've actually never heard anyone say 2 or 3. And in fact, when a couple general counsels have looked it up, they've said, look, at 4, we need to disclose that you have plenty of time, especially if it's your full-time job, you don't have an operating job on top of it, right? I mean, if you have an operating job and a couple of boards, then there's the big red flag hits you in the chest. But if this is what you do full time, I've never heard anyone really go after director unless it's more than 4 publics. And for the women who are on here, the interesting thing that I also find is on board bios and board resumes, the only thing people care about on your board bio and board resume is what other public company boards you sit on. For that exact reason, as well as knowing you have experience. I mean, Emily, is that really inconsistent?
What do you mean that people, do you mean that in a positive way? Like people want to see you have experience at boards, or
Well, people want to have
they don't want you
experience,
to be
but I think I've never had experience with, if you have 3 public boards. I mean, I actually have never heard of a director being dinged by ISS or Glass Lewis if they sit on 3 public boards, or 4,
Yeah.
even 4. It's usually over 4 is my point.
including the board that you're on.
Of course, including the
Yeah.
board you're on.
Yeah, and I think it's more institutional investors that have the strict requirements. So
Mm.
both, and the way it kind of filters into the company is as companies are developing their corporate governance guidelines, right? There's a lot of topics like succession of the CEO, or should there be a director retirement age?
Yeah.
Overboarding is one of those where it's not required to include that, and you're not required to disclose that, but it's starting to filter into companies because NYSE and Nasdaq have indicated it's a topic of interest. ISS and Glass Lewis set out guidelines, and then the institutional investors are really the ones that are pretty cutting edge. Even Fidelities and T. Rowe's of the world are starting to get in the mix of taking, coming out with their proxy advisory guidelines and taking a stand. I agree. I've never seen anyone complain about 3, but I have seen people get nervous about people who are on 4, especially if they're serving on the audit committee or a committee that demands a little bit more time.
Yeah.
And if it's the CEO, that's right. CEO is really encouraged to serve on even less.
Well, if you're a sitting CEO, most of what I've seen is you only get 1 outside board. But all 3 of my current public boards have a limit that say, you can't be on more than 4 public company boards. This assumes you're not the CEO, including the one you're currently sitting on, right? So 4 in total.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems to fit with the listing requirements. I only stress that because it's an interesting discussion that keeps coming up. So maybe we should go on because you've got some other incredible topics here.
Yep. So cybersecurity, data privacy is obviously a topic in the news and has been an increasing topic for public companies for some time. And when we've polled public company general counsels, cybersecurity is usually ranked as the #1 concern. And part of that is that, cybersecurity is both, will you be hacked? Do you have enough, protocols? Is your company trained enough to understand the security requirements to avoid phishing attempts and all of those? But it's also the kind of secondary repercussion to the extent your IT systems are not strong enough and somebody does access your information, data privacy laws come into play, right? So as states and governments are increasing the regulation of personal information, then these cybersecurity attacks can have an even greater repercussion, because you're now violating it's not just the FTC coming after you, it's California, and it's GDPR if you're international. So it's had larger repercussions. Investors obviously understand this and they read the paper. So investor expectations have really sort of exceeded the SEC, which is not uncommon, where investors are expecting to know your information security plans, policies at a high level, your cybersecurity risks, right, where you think is weakest, and your internal oversight, like how are you actually rolling this out in the company? Whose job is it? And when it comes to board of directors, it has historically fallen under the audit committee, right? The audit committee is the board committee most likely to be in charge of risk management generally. So it's natural that as cybersecurity becomes more important, it falls to the audit committee to manage that risk. It has, with the gaining importance, we have actually seen people creating separate cybersecurity committees of the board, which definitely still the vast minority, but interesting to show how important an issue this is becoming. If we've traditionally always had three main committees, cybersecurity committee really is pretty novel. And the other aspect of that is that, we've been so focused on board diversity and how do we think about nominees and how do we find the right people to serve on the board. Now, when people develop their questionnaires or their metrics as to what they look for in identifying possible candidates, IT experience is making the list, right? Because a lot of directors have deep institutional knowledge about the industry, about how a public company runs, about financials. They don't always have a great understanding of how an IT system works and what type of security protocols would be helpful. And if you have the board trying to fulfill its oversight duty and really, asking the company to explain, well, what are you doing internally? Like, what are your policies? What are your procedures? How are you protecting this information? If you don't have a director who has knowledge as to what the gold standard is, it's really hard to know. You'll get the feedback, you'll get the answers, but it's hard to judge whether that's good enough, whether that's up to industry standards, best practices. So seeing IT gain new importance is interesting. And I think especially as boards are looking for diverse candidates who have IT experience are sort of the gold standard at many companies. Obviously, the impact of cybersecurity, it can affect all companies, but has a much higher effect on some companies than others based on the industry they're in, based on the type of data they have, and amount of confidential information that they may have.
Emily, I apologize. I missed the question. The rules on diversity, there was a question whether or not any of the rules you talked about applied to foreign-based companies who may have offices in the US. I think it's different if they're publicly traded in the US as an ADR, but could you just comment? And I apologize. I know the cyber thing's very important, but I forgot to mention that other question.
Totally fine. If it's a foreign-based company, if it's a foreign private issuer, it's probably not having a principal office in California. So the California rules would certainly not apply, even if there is an office, as long as it's not the principal office, those rules don't apply. The SEC disclosure requirements, or if they're listed on Nasdaq, the Nasdaq requirements would apply if they are, required to disclose in the U.S. But you do have instances where, maybe they're listed on NYSE, so they're subject to general SEC disclosure requirements, but not this new Nasdaq rule. Although you do find, the foreign governments are often more progressive than the United States in some of these topics. So it really depends on where the company is based. They may have more stringent rules based on their jurisdiction than they are required to report in the US.
Thank you.
So back to cybersecurity. So I think one other element that cybersecurity insurance has been increasing a lot. Insurance in general has been skyrocketing for companies. Cybersecurity insurance especially. So some companies are actually trying to reduce their premiums by hiring third parties to assess, giving them certifications, right? Like a LEED certification for a building that wants to be shown as green, certain cybersecurity certifications from a variety of consulting firms that will do that now, so that you can show your insurance provider and investors or others that you are doing such a good job in your cybersecurity protection. Related, but a slight tangent is, you may have heard D&O insurance has, for public companies, has just absolutely skyrocketed, like 10 to 15 fold of what it was. So in general, the amount of litigation in public companies, the new risks in public companies, and the insurance market in general has created a really difficult situation for companies trying to manage that expense. And it is quite a shock for private companies going through the process and sort of check the box. We're public now, we need a little bit more insurance, and finding out that that line item is going to quadruple or more. So from an SEC perspective, current disclosure is really risk factors, MD&A, if it affects your business, talk about it, tell the public why it's important. But this is one area where we are expecting more specific disclosure about it. So they haven't come out with a proposed rule yet, but at the last SEC sort of rulemaking agenda meeting, they did list cybersecurity as an area for future regulatory action. So this is an area where we expect more. And on the slide, there's a few, the kind of topics that people think about, like, will it be clarifying what's material for a cyber event? Will it be reporting past instances, or will it be more, holistic? What is your philosophy for cybersecurity? So more to come.
Great.
And then the last sort of known Gensler agenda item, which has also been a topic on everyone's mind lately, is sort of ESG and climate change. And this is a funny one where diversity is a little bit easier to, you can talk narrowly about diversity or broadly about diversity, but ESG and climate change initiatives cover so much ground, right? Sometimes I'll be talking to a company about a topic that I don't even think of as ESG, and I'll realize that they're looking at it through an ESG lens, right? So this can cover a broad category of things, especially depending on the company and the industry it's in. So here's one where I think, probably because it's a newer topic, the SEC and institutional investors are not really synced up yet. Investors are really demanding more information about ESG. Proxy advisory firms now incorporate ESG data into their investor services. ISS has said in some cases they would vote or withhold votes from a board if they think there's a failure of risk oversight for environmental or social issues, including climate change. And again, climate change and the risk of, I was just in a board meeting today of a public company that's based in the seaport. And the risk of climate change there was, which does not necessarily affect the rest of their business, was your office is very close to the water in the seaport, and we're about to sign a 10-year lease. Do you think we should negotiate a shorter lease? Like, are we worried we'll be underwater in 10 years? Which totally caught me by surprise, but makes perfect sense, right? People are worried about ESG and climate change in so many different areas of the business. So I think here's an area where really educating yourself to the extent you're trying to get on a board and bringing a sort of a deep awareness of the way other companies are thinking about ESG and handling ESG can really be a big differentiator. It's really a skill has not been in the board sort of the board profile for a long time, and so can really set yourself apart. And the SEC is still in the phase of optional disclosure, right? Similar to cybersecurity, risk factors, MD&A, let us know how ESG and climate change affects your business. But even though the SEC is not requiring it, we're seeing a lot more optional disclosure. So I'm working on an IPO right now where the underwriters required the company to go get a third-party report. It's usually like an ESG report or a sustainability report. So in the middle of the process, they had to sort of slow down the IPO process, go get this third party to come in and analyze their business model so that they could give this report certifying how they do things in a sustainable way, because they felt like they needed that on the roadshow to be able to talk to investors about that aspect of the business, which 5 years ago certainly wouldn't have happened. So even though it's not currently required, it's sort of the Wild West of like, in what way should you talk about it? Should it be a certification? Should it be your philosophy? Should you be making claims? Because claims in the ESG area that you are more sustainable, less sustainable, can be very tricky from a legal perspective, right? It can be very hard to back those things up. So having third parties validate your information and being careful about what you do and don't say can be critically important when you're talking to investors, which therefore makes it important to management teams and to boards. So I think this is a big area for oversight where there's lots of room for improvement and lots of room for people that have either experience or a desire to become smart in this area.
So, yeah, I just want to add a couple elements. One is that in all my boards, the way we've approached the ESG is we literally peel it apart, because there's a lot of work on G, on the governance, that a lot of companies have focused on for the last, I'll call it 5 to 10 years, depending on how long your company's been around. The S, it's really a mixed bag, but the E has become, which really focuses on the environment or climate, really sort of people are back on their heels, a lot of them. And companies, are, at least based on my information, have literally been taking them apart, and instead of having an ESG committee, which I guess some large companies have done, but more often than not, the different topics are being sort of spearheaded within an existing committee on the board. So the G would naturally be under nom-gov. The S often ends up being actually in compensation committee, and the E ends up being somewhere. In my boards, they seem to throw them to the audit committee because they know I happen to feel strongly about it. It doesn't really belong in audit committee, honestly. But the disclosure stuff all ends up in audit committee. So it's a very interesting. And the question to you, Emily, is, there's a lot of time and effort you can spend on these. And for small companies, they may not have a lot of resources. Is there anything, any guidance you can give people in terms of, because the approaches seem to be all across the board?
Yeah, it's also so company dependent, right? So you can have sort of large company, small company who has more resources or money to throw at it. But it's company dependent based on the industry they're in, right? A company that uses chemicals feels a lot different than a tech company, or a tech company that uses a ton of water to cool its servers. You feel a lot different than a retail company that buys goods locally. So I think that varies a lot. The other thing that varies a lot is whether boards think of it from a reactive perspective, as in, we need to be defensive because we have risks you're right, it's often environmental is sort of the most common one talked about, but we have risks in the ESG area. So what can we do to shore them up versus our company's core value or our mission that we talk about externally is that we want to be judged as an ESG company. We want to be put in the category of an investor's portfolio that says this is an ESG investment, right? Because that gives if you can move yourself into an ESG investment instead of a subscription investment, that's going to give you a lot of benefit in balancing. When an investor balances their portfolio, they typically have more room in that category. So the level of importance varies, right? So as you're thinking about resource allocation, probably matters a lot to how important it is to the company's bottom line. I don't mean financial, but right, sort of the core of the company. That being said, right, you don't have to go. The IPO company I talked about that actually commissioned a third-party report was hugely expensive and hugely time-consuming, right? So that is not going to happen at a smaller company. Smaller companies are going to have to rely much more on networks of best practices, right? So sharing of information, getting of information, and probably spend, because they have less money, probably spend more of their time to actually be out there and, you know, talking to people about what they're doing and letting people know what their initiatives are. So you typically have, you know, what do you have more of, time or money? If you have the money, you pay someone to help you with that report. If you don't have the money, you have to use more of your time.
Thanks. Back to you, Emily.
Sorry about that. Either I was freezing up or something else was freezing up. So I guess the last kind of point, unless anyone has questions on ESG, is that foreign governments have tended to be a lot more progressive than us in this area. So France and Australia already have mandated climate change disclosure. The UK has some required disclosure, but is considering more. New Zealand is also like much more on the map than we are. And I think as the SEC is thinking about, Gensler has made it known by the end of 2021, he wants to have mandatory disclosure on ESG/climate change. So we can expect something is definitely coming. And he has referenced other countries. So looking to what France and Australia are doing, what the UK is doing is probably what they're doing. So probably good to help predict. But most people think the SEC is not going to rely on any third-party metrics or third-party guidance, but is going to come up with their own regime that's sort of a mixed bag of all of these, you know, the best of all these different disclosure regimes. So that's an area that as people are deciding internally, you know, how they think about ESG, they're also trying to predict what the SEC will do. So one example is, right, you can talk about your ESG philosophy or why you're better at, you know, more sustainable than a competitor. But if you can come up with actual quantifiable metrics, like KPIs that you put in your MD&A section and you can report from quarter to quarter, that's just considered, right? That's considered a higher standard, right? So if you show that you are judging and management is making decisions on the business based on these ESG metrics, and you can show each quarter how they compare to the last quarter, that's going to be sort of the best disclosure you can come up with if you're really trying to set yourself apart. So as companies are doing that, right, they're doing that in a world where it's not entirely certain how the SEC will come out. So they may be, you know, they may have stacked up 2 quarters of showing this data, and now they're going to have to switch tracks. So still a little bit uncertain, but everybody knows it's going to be a priority. And the other place it comes into play a lot besides sort of MD&A is executive comp. So we are seeing for companies where it is important to the mission of the company and to its, you know, investment story, we are seeing executive compensation tied to different ESG metrics. If no questions, then I just had 2 more topics that I wanted to mention, and then I'm happy to open it up. COVID-19 and SPACs, 2 things which I feel like I have done the entire pandemic. So COVID-19 is obviously has affected companies in a myriad of ways, but focusing really on public company disclosure. We all sort of thought that we were past that. Like 2020 was the year of saying how COVID affected your business. And now it's been really unusual that we've had to talk about the continuing effect, right? 2021 has been a lot different than people expected, to the extent where filings being made over last spring and last summer sort of talked about how COVID affected the company, past tense. The SEC was issuing a lot of comments saying, that's great, but tell us how it's continuing to affect your business now. So you'll notice a shift in public disclosure, really talking about the continued effect of COVID, or what if it gets worse? What is that risk to the business if things start to not improve the way folks all hope it will? The other strange thing about COVID has been, for some companies, it has been a boon, right? Some companies have actually done much better because of COVID-19. So I'm thinking of exercise equipment manufacturers, certain e-commerce companies have all seen huge spikes in their business. And so there it's really kind of a mix of how do we talk about, there are still certain risks and negative effects to the workforce and disruptions from work, but financially things may look a lot better because of COVID-19. So while they want to brag about that to some extent, that's also a very awkward position to be in, right? To seem like you are touting success based on a pandemic. So there's a lot of sort of thinking that goes into that. And then the other risk that we've seen is companies who are either going out by IPO, SPAC, direct listing now, and they're coming off a year and a half of really strong revenues that are COVID driven, getting investors for questions on the roadshow saying, well, what will happen when things get back to normal? Like, is your revenue going to drop once people are going back to their offices or going back to their gyms? So it's almost the reverse of what people expected, is that a fear that the company's metrics will actually be worse as the pandemic ends, which again is an awkward thing socially to kind of put in your filings, but people are having to answer those questions. The other sort of still, residual effect is virtual annual meetings. So COVID hit started in the US right around the time of annual meetings. So a lot of people had to switch their in-person meeting to a virtual annual meeting and kept with it for the 2021 annual meeting. Say pre-pandemic, probably 10% of our public companies had virtual annual meetings. Now 100% do. And I think probably most will actually keep it going forward. And it used to be that virtual annual meetings were considered, there's some positive aspects in that people could go, whereas oftentimes, we'd have them in our office and we'd put out 2 cups of coffee because we knew nobody would show up. But now people can actually attend, right? You can have people from all over the world come and hear the information at annual meetings. It used to be considered sort of a negative because you didn't have that in-person back and forth. But now that people have done it more, now that people are more focused on ESG and realizing it means people aren't having to travel to get to a physical location to have these big meetings, that in some cases, thinking, like Apple, are quite lavish meetings where there's a lot of spending and a lot of non-sustainable things happening. Virtual annual meetings are actually becoming a positive thing. So I think we're probably, I want to say stuck with them. I think we're probably continuing to use them in the future. And then there's the more operational, where boards have oversight, but it's really, monitoring how the company is implementing COVID protocols in a really, awkward situation. So whether or not to mandate vaccines, whether to allow testing if not vaccinated, when to return to the office, whether to have masks returning to the office. I don't hear boards getting really deep in the weeds, but I do hear consistent COVID questions at each meeting, sort of, have there been any cases in the office? What's your office density like now? What's your philosophy? So keeping an eye on the decisions that management's making and making sure they're tuned to both safety elements, but also, the stakeholders, how the employees feel about what's being required of them. Has been sort of a constant topic of discussion.
So the only thing I would ask you is, what has come up recently is the US government has been basically telling companies that if you sell to the US government, that your employees need to be 100% vaccinated. You have to demonstrate that you are 100% vaccinated, which if you think about large companies and small companies, what do you do? And so this has been a topic, even in some of the companies I have, which are at 80 or 90%, it's, you know, do you really just say you have to be 100% vaccinated and those employees leave? Have you, can you give us any more insight into this?
Well, mainly that I don't have the answer for how to handle that. I have not had any of my clients actually lay people off, right? I do keep hearing about it in the news that companies have set deadlines for compliance. And if not, then they have 200 openings because, you know, that's the number of people who have not gotten vaccinated. So other than following the chatter and the reports in the news, I haven't had to deal with a company who has been in that situation. I more likely hear companies kind of having the philosophical debate of, you know, should we require it? We don't have to, but should we not? You know, what's our approach to this?
Okay. And I know it's already getting late and we're going to lose, I know we have to shut down by 6:20. So we should hit the last slide and then I have a closing question. I don't see anything else in the chat, so.
Good. So the last topic, which I think you kind of can't talk about public company boards without at least mentioning the existence of SPACs, because they've come in so many different ways, including, you know, at board meetings with companies that have nothing to do with SPACs, where the directors themselves are serving on SPAC boards or trying to get people to invest in their SPAC. Because it is such a hot topic, because it is such a trend, it seems to come up. When it comes to actual board service, there's sort of three varieties, right? There is serving on the board of a SPAC, which would be the special purpose acquisition vehicle, which is really, right, just a company formed to raise money to eventually acquire another company. So that board service is extremely light. It's usually a pretty small board. There's not much going on other than the decision about what company to acquire. And usually that SPAC board, either all of it or 90% of it leaves as part of the actual SPAC transaction. So it's a relatively small time commitment, short period. Then there's the serving on the board who wants to de-SPAC. So the company that would be acquired in a SPAC transaction is often referred to as de-SPACing. So serving on a private company board when they're thinking about going public usually through a number of ways. You know, should we IPO? Should we do a SPAC transaction? Should we direct list? Brings up sort of another different unique set. And then there's also the concept of that private company board. As it's entered into a business combination arrangement with a SPAC, it's going to become a public company by a SPAC transaction. That private company often then looks to add to its board. It looks to add independent directors. It looks to add financial experts or other, you know, industry experts to its board, because it now quickly needs to ramp up its board from being a private company board to a public company board. And one thing that is so unique about, and so that's really, I think that's the most interesting role, is like joining a private company as it's about to de-SPAC, and the one most worthy of sort of thought and discussion, because often the companies, this is not universal, but often the companies that are looking to de-SPAC, it is a benefit to them to go public through that particular structure, likely because an IPO would not be as productive. So a direct listing is usually off the table because a direct listing does not raise any money. An IPO and a SPAC are usually the two comparisons, but an IPO, you really need to be able to tell a revenue story, even if it's that you're not revenue positive, but you need to be able to tell a story, you need to be able to sell it to the street. A de-SPAC transaction, you don't. And in an IPO, you have to tell that story, and you don't know until the very end of the process. After you've spent 6 months, you don't know if it's worked or not. You don't know what those investors are going to value the company at until the night of pricing, at which point you've already spent, tons of time and energy on the process. In the SPAC transaction, you find out at the very outset, you pick the valuation, and the only people you have to convince are the narrow set of the SPAC who wants to acquire you, and the very narrow set of PIPE investors that you can tell about the deal and you bring in to fund the overall transaction. So you're dealing with a much smaller group of people. You're dealing with them in a way that's outside the IPO requirements. So you can tell them projections in a way that a public company could not tell projections in an IPO process. In a SPAC, you actually can tell them projections. So you can sell your story in a way that is more familiar, dealing one-on-one with investors, and know that you'll get to be a public company at a time when perhaps your company is not ready to go public normal ways. What that means for the board is often that the public company readiness is not in place the way it would be when you're ramping up to an IPO, right? You see it on the horizon, you start to get your PCAOB financials in order, you start to think about the board composition, you start to think about hiring the people that you need to have the internal controls and procedure. The SPAC transaction tends to come at you a lot more quickly and mean that the company does not have as much of that preparedness already done and needs to cram it into a much shorter period of time. So it can be a really steep learning curve for a company and can be really challenging for directors because they need to bring a lot more, substantive knowledge to the management team, and they need to help them ramp up much more quickly than otherwise. So it can certainly be an excellent board service and tends to be very high growth companies, but I think brings a lot more risk and a lot more work than a normal traditional IPO process for a private company. And happy to talk more about the SEC's view of SPACs, the PIPE market, but I know we're a little bit over time, so maybe we leave a little bit of room for questions. Ellen, what do you think?
Yeah, well, let me ask you one, because literally we've got 3 minutes left. So, and I apologize, there have been a couple good questions that just hit chat, but I do want to ask you the following question, because I'd be remiss. These are very well-educated, accomplished women who are on this program listening to you. And if you were going to give a piece of guidance, what kinds of legal due diligence should be done before you actually join a public company board?
Mm-hmm. I want to say lots. That's a little bit too broad, but I think this is another one of those, like I started off by talking about when you're in a board meeting, it can be difficult to strike that balance between not micromanaging, but making sure you're, being proactive and getting the information you need. I think it's similar when you're considering a public company board, right? You should not walk in sight unseen, even if there are extremely sophisticated, impressive directors already on the board. I would not take that as a proxy for for your own confidence in the company, because Theranos had a pretty impressive board too. So I think you do have to do a level of diligence, and you need to do it in a way that preserves the relationship, right? You need to be excited about the company, trust in the company, but also check the boxes, to which this is a weird plug for lawyers, but I know we have several on the call. So I think actually having your law firm do the diligence helps remove it from you personally, right? So it's not Emily Taylor who is questioning your board committee charters or how the CEO compensation is set or any of the internal dynamics. It's Emily Taylor's law firm, right? It removes that from you personally and shows that you're diligent and you're paying attention to the details. You're not a pushover, but also preserves the sense that you're not second guessing the company. You're not assuming you're going to uncover fraud. So from a personal perspective, right, the great thing about public companies is you can read their 10Ks, their 10Qs, their 8Ks. You can go on the Edgar site and you can learn a lot about them in advance, which can then help you ask a shorter number of questions. I wouldn't send over even a 3-page diligence checklist. That would probably be offensive to a company. But you can read enough about them to be able to ask the half dozen questions, right, that are conversational and really help get at, well, what is this company's philosophy on the things that matter to me and the things that are critical to their business. And the last thing I'd say is probably the most effective diligence you can do is talking to every single director on the board already and casually getting their opinion, right? Like, what's the relationship with management? Do they do things in group meetings, or are there a lot of one-off phone calls with each director? You know, how often do they meet? What's the discussion like? Does someone dominate the conversation? Does it go around the room? Just really getting that sort of EQ sense of the company, because I think that tells you a lot about how the board operates and whether it's the type of board you would feel comfortable serving on.
Well, Emily, this has been fabulous, and I know we're over our time at this point. Because Hillary has to get to her own board meeting, and I can't thank the folks, and I apologize to the folks in chat who did put some good questions in there. We just ran out of time. Emily, thank you so much from the Boston Club. You're fabulous, and I know I learned some things during this conversation, so I'm very, very grateful. So thank you so much.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And the presentation will go out as a follow-up. Hillary will be sending the presentation out.
Yeah, so you'll get it from Marlene from info@the-Boston Club. So be looking for that. And we've recorded this, so if you want to go back and listen, you have that too. Emily, thank you. Rich conversation, engaging conversation. We could probably be talking for another hour or two. We look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. With that, remember, November 4th, sign up for the corporate salute. And then our last Board Ed Finance 2.0 will be November 15th.
And let me explain Finance 2.0 is it's finance. It's what every director needs to understand about finance. This is not for audit chairs. This is, you're sitting in that room, you're a full participant as a director. If you don't know the following things about finance and can't ask these questions, don't sit in that room. I mean, I've seen more.
But come on the 15th to hear about it. So if you're afraid of finance, this is the one to come listen to and talk to Ellen.
Yep.
Anyway, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. See you at another Boston Club event. We got a lot of good feedback, Emily, about your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily, so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
So Hillary, but you know, as we're